Did the Romans leave DNA in Britain? Oh yes, they absolutely did. Don't know how much detail you want me to go into that. Why didn't the Romans conquer Scotland? So, let's stop you right there. Who lived in Britain before the Romans? Well, that would be the Britons. Was Roman Britain useless? No, it absolutely was not useless. How dare you say that? Hello, my name is Tristan Hughes. I'm the host of the Ancients podcast, one of the greatest history podcasts out there. You have my word. And I am here, a team have brought me in to answer the most Googled questions about Roman Britain. Britannia! It's going to be good fun. I think they've got a whole array for me on this screen in front. And without further ado, let's get going. Very easy one to get started. When did Roman Britain start and end? Now I say easy, but actually it's a bit more complicated than might first seem to be. I'm going to take Roman Britain as being when the province is first officially declared, and that is at the end of the Roman invasion of Britain under the Emperor Claudius and his key general Aulus Plautius, and that is 43 AD, when they received the surrenders of several British chieftains at what is present-day Colchester. In regards to the end, well, that's an interesting one. Some would say 408, others would say 410. I think we can just say about the end of the 5th century AD, and that is when the Roman administration of Britain comes to an end, and the famous, albeit quite debatable, letter is sent from the Roman Emperor Honorius to the Britons to say, look to your own defences. So I think we could say roughly about 43 AD, yes, to around about 410 AD. Aha! Who lived in Britain before the Romans? Well, that would be the Britons. The word Celts is often thrown about, and I think it's okay to say Celts. They're definitely very similar culture to the Celts, but we probably shouldn't label them Celts. We should call them Iron Age Britons because there is a little difference between them. However, culturally, there is very large similarities. For instance, the great talks, these symbols of authority, you find that in Iron Age Britain, and you also find that in Celtic society too, on the continent. We have no written records really about who these people are. We just have archaeological remains. We have the great hill forts, such as Maiden Castle. You have amazing archaeological remains like the Battersea Shield, the Waterloo Helmet. You have amazing burials too. But we don't really know who these people were, their methods of governance, their society and so on. So they're still quite a mysterious peoples. We do have a couple of literary mentions about the island of Britain and the Britons before the Romans. One of the most interesting is a figure called Pythias, or Pythias. Pythias, he was an explorer from the Greek city-state of Massalia, modern-day Marseille in southern France. And in the late 4th century BC, he did a great expedition. He sailed around Britain, may have got as far as Orkney and Scandinavia. We don't have his account surviving, but we have little bits of it surviving through other sources. And he labels the people of Britain the Prytani, which literally means the painted people, presumably alluding to the fact that they painted their bodies with either tattoos or paint. And then Julius Caesar later talks about Iron Age Britons covering themselves in something called woad, this kind of blue colour, so they painted themselves too. But in answer to this question, who lived in Britain before the Romans, we should call them the Iron Age Britons. Were there cities in Britain before the Romans? Cities? No. No cities, nothing like that. Nothing in the scale of places like Rome or Athens or Alexandria, so on and so forth. There were, I would say, the Iron Age equivalent, and I stress equivalent, of towns in the Iron Age. And I think you need to look at places like Maiden Castle, for instance, an impressive hill fort near Dorchester today. On that hill fort at the top, there were lots of the remains of round buildings, of round houses, and it seems to be almost kind of this Iron Age town planning. There are roads, maybe an elite area of the hill fort too, which is really interesting, but that's kind of your Iron Age equivalent of a town. Later on, at the time that the Romans start interacting with the Britons, so this is like the 1st century BC, you do start to see a bit of a shift and these new centres of power emerging. Some people have labelled proto-towns, and these are often labelled, still debated this stuff, oppida. And you see examples of oppida in Gaul, in present-day France, but basically these were also probably these ceremonial centres for king-like figures of these tribes in late Iron Age Britain. The most prominent example that survives is Colchester. Iron Age Colchester, Camulodunum, which had strong links with the Roman continent, amazing trade links. That all being said, it doesn't seem like, let's say, Maiden Castle, where the interior of Maiden Castle with all these roundhouses seem to suggest like an Iron Age suburbia almost. The interior of Colchester isn't jam-packed full of roundhouses. It's really spread out. There doesn't seem to be much settlement. Most people seem to be living outside of the dikes of this oppida. So it seems to actually not really be a city that we would think of it as, but maybe as a ceremonial centre. So you do get these interesting kind of proto-urban towns, these Iron Age equivalents, I guess you could say, in the Iron Age in Britain. However, you get nothing like the towns and cities of ancient Rome, of Greece, of the Mediterranean world existing in Britain before the arrival of the Romans, when they start creating their own colonies and ultimately cities like London. Why did Caesar, Gaius Julius Caesar, why did he invade Britain? So this is referring to 55 and 54 BC, Julius Caesar's two invasions of Britain that occurred during the height of his Gallic Wars. He's reached the northern coast of Gaul and he looks across the Channel Sea and he knows about Britain. Britain is still a mysterious land to Julius Caesar and the Romans at this time. They know more about the southeast, the area of Kent and places like that, which have stronger links with Gaul, with France, but it's still very mysterious. And this is Julius Caesar. He has this strong sense of self-destiny that he is going to surpass all before him. And so when he hears about this mysterious land across the sea, full of these people, these troublesome, or not troublesome, but warlike people, difficult people to control, I think there is a sense in Julius Caesar that he sees it as a bit of a challenge. And he wants to see what he can do if he can conquer Britain as well, because he has this huge self-confidence in his own ability as a general. But there is a more practical purpose as well, according to Caesar's writings. He hears that apparently Britons have been giving refuge to Gauls who've been fleeing his campaign, his conquest of Gaul. So I think it's a mixture of things. That there's a practical purpose of Britain helping, certain Britons supporting the Gauls in their resistance against Julius Caesar, but also Julius Caesar's, his great belief in his self-destiny and that he's destined to surpass all others. And what greater challenge was there than to be able to try and conquer the mysterious land at the edges of the known world that was Britain. Who conquered Britain? Well, following on from the last question, not Julius Caesar. He did two invasions, he got quite far, maybe as far as Wheathampstead. Definitely got north of the River Thames, and then he goes back. He goes back to Gaul, he completes his conquest of Gaul, and then he fights the civil wars. And then, of course, there are civil wars following Caesar's assassination, and the Romans are very much focused in on, on the end of the Roman Republic and then the birth of the Roman Empire. And Britain is kind of left alone. Well, it is left alone for almost a century following Caesar's departure. But in regards to who conquered Britain, it's like an onion. There are many layers to that. If we're talking about who conquered the Roman province of Britannia when that comes into being, well, then you would say 43 AD. If we're talking about the geographical landmass of Britain in its entirety, then no Roman conquered Britain because they never managed to conquer the entire landmass. Maybe the closest you could get would be someone like Agricola, the governor who launches campaigns in northern Britain in the 80s AD, but he doesn't complete it. His fleet circumnavigates the British Isles, but that's as far as they go. Perhaps you could look at someone who managed a great deal of expansion on this island in the Roman period. Both Antoninus Pius's generals and then Septimius Severus himself managed to expand Roman control further north. What did Romans think of British people? Well, first off, the Romans with their it's quite a racial ideology. They considered anyone who weren't themselves, didn't speak Latin or Greek, spoke other languages, they considered them barbarians. And this was a horrible word used by the Romans to denigrate other peoples, to label them as inferior and uncivilized in their eyes. And I think they certainly would have thought that about the Britons, because the Britons, they don't live in great towns like the Romans do in the Mediterranean world. They live in small farmsteads. I think the Romans also think about the Britons as quite strange. The fact that they're led by women in a couple of cases, obviously the story of Boudica, is very interesting to Roman writers like Tacitus and even Cassius Dio. He gives a great speech, almost certainly made up speech, put into Boudica's mouth at the beginning of her revolt. And of course there's another queen called Cartimandua. And this idea of powerful queens, I think, is quite alien to the Romans. Were there uprisings against the Romans? Well, the short answer to that is yes, there was. And in Roman Britain, the most famous, of course, is the revolt led by Boudica, the wife of the king of the Iceni, Prasutagus. Following Prasutagus' death, Boudica, she rallies the Iceni and other tribes too to unite, and they form a great resistance against the Romans. What you have is an incredibly bloody revolt. Boudica, she sacks 3 different towns, Colchester first of all. She then destroys part of a Roman legion and then goes on to lay waste to London, Londinium, which was this great trading centre. She then sacks St. Albans, so that's the 3rd of those great cities that she sacks, these Roman settlements. She's finally defeated at the Battle of Watling Street and the rebellion is crushed. But that was a real dice with death for the Romans during these early stages of the Roman conquest and then consolidation of the province of Britannia. But one other figure I want to mention is one near the start, just before Boudica, because he is sometimes overlooked, but he's an extraordinary figure. And this is a man called Caractacus, or Caratacus, depending on how you pronounce his name. And he leads a resistance against the Romans for several years. He's involved in trying to fight against the initial invasion of Britain by the Romans in 43. He keeps resisting. He goes to Wales in the west. He fights for several years, ambushing, kind of guerrilla warfare against the Romans, being a huge nuisance. But finally, he is drawn into an actual battle with the Romans, Caradoc, and he is defeated, taken to Rome, where he is pardoned by the emperor. But the short answer to the question, after my long ramblings there, is yes, there were uprisings against the Romans. So much so that some, like my good friend Dr. Simon Elliott, have called Roman Britain the Wild West of the Roman Empire. How did Rome develop Britain? Well, the interesting thing with the Romans in Britain, and this is something that a good friend of mine has done a lot of work on over the years, even wrote a book about it, Dr. Miles Russell. He has highlighted that actually in the story of Rome and Britain, the Romans bring almost these kind of like bubbles of Romanness to Britain. These great centres like the creation of new settlements, London, Lincoln, York, Chester. These settlements all do appear and they are very Roman in their outlook. They'll have aqueducts, they'll have sewers, they'll have roads. So the Romans do bring a lot of their culture, a lot of their sports as well. Gladiatorial combat would certainly have happened in Britain. So the Romans developed Britain in a number of ways, by creating these urban settlements, by linking them together with this infrastructure that we associate with the Romans all across their empire, but also militarily too. One of the greatest legacies of the Romans in Britain is, of course, Hadrian's Wall. Did Romans marry Britons? Almost certainly yes, and I think actually get rid of that almost certainly. The answer is yes. Most prominently you would be able to see that in northern Britain with soldiers who had been stationed along the frontier, places like Hadrian's Wall, because we know in Roman forts, as soon as they're established, not long afterwards, you would see the emergence of a civilian settlement nearby called a vicus, which would take advantage of the mercantile opportunities of having a whole host of Roman soldiers at your doorstep. That could be food, that could be entertainment, those could be brothels, but those would also include Britons who were kind of making the most of the Roman presence there, kind of adapting to Roman culture. Not all of them would continue living in small farmsteads. Marriage is not officially allowed in the Roman army until the time of Emperor Septimius Severus in the early 3rd century AD. But like non-official marriages and relationships would have been there all the time. It's not too much of a stretch to suggest that some of the Roman soldiers stationed at places like Hadrian's Wall would have taken local wives and then settled down there. It's likely that's certainly the makeup of the Roman garrisons along Hadrian's Wall by the end of the Roman period, that many of the soldiers up there had been living up there for generations, married local women and so on and so forth. Did the Romans leave DNA in Britain? Oh yes, they absolutely did. Don't know how much detail you want me to go into that, but let's just talk about there are quite a lot of skeletons that have been recovered from the Roman period in Britain. Roman London is a great example of this. Not far from where I am doing this interview today, on what is today Spitalfields Market. When that was being built, big excavation done there. They uncovered a Roman cemetery because that was just outside the walls of Roman London, and they found a number of skeletons. There's one known as the Spitalfields woman, and they were able to do DNA testing, ADNA, on the remains to figure out where they came from. And it's interesting that the DNA has revealed that some of these people came from quite far, from elsewhere in the Roman Empire, from beyond Britain's shores, showing how the makeup of a place like London, it wasn't just of Britons and Romans, it was the people coming from all parts of the Roman Empire, this great trading hub during its height. So yes, that's just one example. There are many examples of skeletons that have been discovered and bone remains from Romans or people who lived in Roman Britain during the time of Roman rule that have revealed more about the people, about the makeup of Roman Britain. Did Romans like Britain? It's cold, it's wet, it's windy, it's very different to the Mediterranean climate that they're accustomed to. So I think for Romans who are coming from a place like the Mediterranean world, Britain, it wasn't ideal. It was cold, the days get short in the winter, particularly as you go further north. It seems to be raining all the time. There's no Mediterranean climate at all. There are no olive trees or anything like that. So I think many Romans would have seen it as quite an alien land. That being said, in regards to resources, we might come back to this a bit later, but for Roman merchants and so on, you can make a pretty penny coming to Britain and then going back to the heartlands of the Roman Empire and selling highly sought after goods, whether that be tin, lead, gold, woolen goods, mastiff hunting dogs, agriculture as well. Britain very much pulls its weight in the Roman Empire when talking about economic production and raw resources that Britain can provide. So maybe on a mercantile, on an economic front, the Romans were quite happy with Britain because Britain did pay them quite a lot of money. Was Roman Britain useless? No, it absolutely was not useless. How dare you say that? Roman Britain was not useless in any way, shape or form. Economically, it gave a lot to the Roman Empire. Fertile lands, woolen goods, gold resources, lead, tin. These important resources that are ferried, transported into the Roman Empire, that certainly make Britain a valuable part of the Roman Empire. It's also not useless for potential usurpers of the Roman Empire, and you'll see that later in the story of Roman Britain and the Roman Empire. Britain has 3 legions, sometimes 4 legions at its disposal. It's got a lot of military manpower because the island is not conquered in its entirety, so it needs a big military presence, and that is great for people wanting soldiers to instate themselves as the new Roman emperor. You get it, for instance, with Septimius Severus's main rival, a man called Clodius Albinus. You get it during the 3rd century crisis a couple of times. One of the key factors that is sometimes labelled to the fall of Roman Britain is one of these last usurpers who takes the last so-called the field troops out of Britain, and I think that's in 407, 408 AD, and that is Constantine III. And you even get usurpers, evidence of usurpers, into the early 5th century, right at the end of Roman Britain. Roman Britain was certainly not useless. Why was Hadrian's wall built? Well, I can tell you about that. Early 2nd century AD, the Emperor Hadrian comes to Britain on his great tour across the Roman Empire, and it's either when he's in Britain, in York, Roman Eboracum, or before he arrives that the building of Hadrian's Wall, his famous namesake wall, begins. Now at this time the Romans had tried to conquer territory further north. They had almost a buffer zone in that area of what is northern England, southern Scotland today. It's also a time where they've recently taken full control of a people called the Brigantes in northwestern England, and the Brigantes, maybe they've been a bit unruly at this time, and there is very much a desire by the Romans to create a monumental frontier to show that the Romans are here, they've arrived, they are the superpower, and they are here to stay. And what better way to show their power and how they can outmatch any peoples in northern Britain at that time by constructing this monumental barrier. It was showing off Roman power. It had an outward purpose in the fact that it was separating Roman Britannia from Barbaricum beyond, but it's also a symbol to those Britons who are now living within the Roman Empire in the north, like the Brigantes, to say, you're now under Roman control. Don't mess with us, because these are the types of things that we can create that you would not be able to build in your wildest dreams. So very much, I think Hadrian's Wall, there's a practical purpose for it as being kind of a defense line, but it is also very much a statement of power and authority. Where was the best and worst place to be posted in Roman Britain? Oh God, it's difficult. So, of course, Roman Britain is almost 400 years old in how long it lasts. And I think over time, certain areas would have looked more appealing if you're a Roman soldier to others at different stages. Let's talk about worst place first of all. I would say maybe someone like Ardagh Roman Fort or Intuthil Roman Fort, which is north of the Antonine Wall in Midlands, Scotland. But that is uncharted territory. The people don't like you nearby. And we do hear from Tacitus in his Agricola that there is a devastating attack on a fort in northern Britain during his campaigns in Scotland, which leaves quite a large part of the 9th Legion absolutely mauled in this attack. So maybe someone like that, probably one of the worst postings. I think being anywhere along Hadrian's Wall wouldn't have been a great posting. Best place, as I said, further south, which is the full-fat part, functioning part of the Roman Empire. Maybe somewhere like the Cripplegate Fort in London during those decades following the Boudiccan destruction, and you really see London's revival. I think that would have been really, really fascinating to see. Why didn't the Romans conquer Scotland? So let's stop you right there. The Romans did conquer quite a bit of Scotland. They conquered large parts up to, as I mentioned, like the middle area, the Midland area of Scotland, the Glasgow, Edinburgh line, the Gask Ridge a bit further north, just beneath the Highland belt. But of course, those Roman occupations of those areas, they were rather temporary. You get, of course, Agricola. In the 1st century AD, you then get a period under the reign of the Emperor Antoninus Pius in the mid-2nd century AD, and then you get Septimius Severus campaigning up there in the early 3rd century AD. And you can see today in Scotland, it's really, really interesting, some fantastic Roman remains. But we can't run away from the fact that the Romans do never conquer the entirety of Scotland. And I think there are two reasons for it. I think the main reason is that the Romans didn't think it was worth the time or effort. It would have taken a lot of time to traverse the Highlands of Scotland. People are scattered about. There are no great cities or towns. The people don't want to live in that kind of way either. Some of them may even still be living in brochs, these beautiful stone towers that dominates the Highlands and the islands of Scotland as well. There's little appetite for the Romans to try and pacify that wild area in the far north. The other thing is that, yes, the Romans could conquer an area, and if they really put their hearts and minds to it, they probably could have conquered the north of Britain. But that's only half of the whole deal. You've then got to try and consolidate Roman control. You've got to try and introduce Roman culture. And it's already proven hard enough for the Romans to do that further south, where you still get many Iron Age Britons living in their small farmsteads, not migrating to these towns and adopting Roman culture. Think how much harder it will be for them to do that in the northern part of Scotland. So why didn't the Romans conquer Scotland? I would argue it's not that they couldn't have done it if they put their minds to it. They probably thought that it wasn't worth the time and effort first to conquer and then to consolidate. Was Constantine the Great British? No, he wasn't British, but he does have a link to Roman Britain because it was in York in 306 AD. I think it was February 306 AD, or at least February is when Septimius Severus dies in York, almost 100 years earlier. It's in 306 AD that Constantine, he is in Roman York when his dad, Constantius Chlorus, dies. They've been campaigning north of Hadrian's Wall. We don't know too much about that campaign. Constantine's father dies, and the soldiers proclaim Constantine as the new emperor. And Constantine's journey as emperor, it begins in York. He won't stay in Roman Britain long. He will never return to Roman Britain because he then, of course, goes on to defeat the other challengers, the other emperors, Basil of the Milvian Bridge, for instance, 312 AD, his flirting conversion to Christianity too, and that's a whole another story. But Constantine the Great, certainly not British, but he has a link to Britain because it was in York that he was proclaimed emperor, where his story, his great emperor story, all begins. And you can see today outside York Minster, in the centre of York, you can see a great statue dedicated to that being the place where Constantine was proclaimed emperor. When did Roman Britain become Christian? Well, I would argue that it never became Christian in its entirety. I think you can see in the archaeology the elites, the Roman elites, flirting with Christianity. There's a brilliant wall fresco from Lullingston Roman Villa which shows the Cairo, a Christian symbol. And certainly Christianity seems to have reached Britain, especially by the 4th century AD. But it never becomes the dominant religion in Roman Britain. The Emperor Theodosius makes Christianity like the official religion in the 390s, but I don't think that it really filters through to Britain before the Roman administration ends in Britain in the early 5th century AD. I would argue, and I'm sure there are other opinions out there, that Christianity really takes hold in Britain after the Romans leave, and a bit later when you get the arrivals of figures like St. Augustine and in Canterbury and so on and so forth. I think it's a bit of a misleading question to say when did Roman Britain become Christian, because I don't think it ever really did. Why did Rome abandon Britain? Oh, this is the million-dollar question, and I'm certainly not the forefront of an academic to talk about the fall of Roman Britain and all of its complexities. There's some fantastic academics out there. James Gerard, Dominic Perring's done a bit on the end of Roman London. Rob Collins has done a lot about Hadrian's Wall and the like. Lots of great work done on the fall of Roman Britain, and it is, short answer is, it is very, very complex. I think you need to look at the wider picture though, because in the early 5th century AD, the Roman Empire is split in two. You've got the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire, and the Western Roman Empire is in a lot of trouble. You've got a huge influx of what they would call barbarian Germanic peoples, not just Germanic as well, but a lot of these peoples migrating into the Roman Empire. A lot of debate about the makeup of those migrations. And that in itself is nothing really new, but what is new is the great scale of them. And that is causing trouble for the Roman Empire and its administration. You get the Vandals and Sueves and making their way down into Spain. You've got the Goths as well making their way into the west. You'll ultimately get the sack of Rome in 410 AD, around the time the Roman administration in Britain ends. And I think that very much puts Britain on the periphery of people's minds and almost cuts off Britain in a way. So the Roman Empire has a lot else on its plate when the Romans abandon Britain in 410. There is also talk about being an economic meltdown, an economic collapse in Roman Britain. Bit of a debate as to the extent of that economic collapse, but that is sometimes put forward as a reason. Look, there is still so much debate. There aren't many literary sources for this time, and it is very much focusing on archaeology, and more archaeology coming from the ground, whether it's pottery or coin hoards or what's happening up in Hadrian's Wall, what's happening in London, and so on and so forth. So the great question of why, there are better people to answer that than myself, but what I will say is it's very complex. What happened to locals after Rome left? Well, I think this, and once again this is going back to Miles Russell's work on this, it is emphasising how Roman culture doesn't really take too much hold outside the bubbles of Romanness that are the cities and the forts and the villas in the countryside and so on. The rest of the Iron Age British population, the British population, kind of keep living as they do in their wooden roundhouses and long houses, and I think they just kind of continue like that following the end of the Roman administration. They're just not paying their taxes to the Romans anymore, but that is soon filled by those elites living in their villas or elsewhere who, it looks like, fill that vacuum very quickly. They realise that they haven't got the protection of Rome anymore, but then they decide to hire their own soldiers. This is theory, but I think it's quite a likely theory. They hire soldiers with the money they have available, they gain retinues, and then they start creating their mini little kingdoms, little areas of power in what was once Roman Britain, and exacting taxes from people that way. So what happens to the locals after the Romans left, or the Roman administration leaves? Because not all the Romans leave, it is the Roman administration that ends. I think many keep going on their daily lives. It would be very hard, it would be changes absolutely in the ways that they lived and who they're paying taxes to, and obviously there would have been a period of upheaval, and then you get the arrivals of Saxons and so on a bit later. It is a time of change, but I think their lifestyles largely stayed the same, and you even see in some places the revival of one of the great symbols of Iron Age Britain, which is the hill forts. Hill forts come back into fashion in the post-Roman period. Maybe they become new seats of power for these elites that have risen to the fore in the vacuum that the Romans have left. There we go. A look through some of the most Googled questions about Roman Britain. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want even more ancient history, you can check out my podcast, The Ancients, where we cover everything going from Hadrian's Wall to the Neanderthals, released twice a week. And if you did enjoy this video and want similar, well, hit that subscribe button. Subscribe to the History Hit YouTube channel. There is much more coming your way.